Well, I have been 34 for a week, and I must say, based on last week, do not recommend, though I am, of course, heavily biased by the fact that the events of last week were what they were rather than the age itself being the issue. And so sitting here at the beginning of 34 and also kind of entering that season of reflection with the holidays coming up in terms of my reading life, I thought today it would be an interesting experiment to look at what I was reading a decade ago, because my reading life has been robust for a decade. I mean, my reading life has always been robust, but I have been out of college now for a decade plus a little. And so with that, 2014 was my first year fully out of school and really was me starting to shape my adult reading life in a very real way. And these reading years really still hold a very special place in my heart, even as I feel like I have evolved a lot as a reader since then. But on the other hand, there are some things that really stay with me. And even glancing at this list and not having done the full dig yet, it's interesting to see what has stayed with me from this time in my reading life that doesn't feel as far away as it really is. So before we dive all the way into that, hi, my name is Melody if you haven't been here before, and it continues to be Melody if you have, but thank you for being here. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, and if that is of interest to you, I would love for you to hang out more. Liking and subscribing helps with that. So let's go ahead and set the stage for 23-year-old Melody, who was fresh out of college. I spent the beginning of the year in Cleveland at the Cleveland Playhouse as an apprentice in the literary management and dramaturgy departments, and then I spent the second half of the year home in my hometown as a substitute teacher as I was preparing for my eventual move to Chicago, which we know, because it's a decade later, I succeeded in, because I have been in Chicago just shy of a decade now. And so at the time, or before I was at this age, I think I had this idea that I was going to have everything figured out by like 23, 24. And I think that that is a very common thing to think for someone in their early 20s, and it's very common to feel behind and lost. And I'm not saying that that goes away in your 30s by any means, but I think that it's very interesting because I can see so clearly now myself kind of finding myself through my reading life, and that's always kind of been the case. And just how my reading life is a reflection on me, yes, but it's also such a very distinct reflection on the time. And I think that this is very important as well, because at this time in my reading life, I was discovering blogs really for the first time and engaging with them. I had just discovered Book Riot. I was a big Book Riot fan in my 20s, and that helped open me up to new titles that I might not have discovered as organically otherwise, and really helped me diversify my reading. But I think especially now in the current moment, especially as we're talking about this idea of reading being political, it seems silly to say that out loud because that's just how it is, but also we have a lot of people who have been joining, like I've mentioned before, online bookish spaces in the last couple of years. I don't know. I'm saying I've been here before. I cannot speak to anyone else. But I think we take for granted the diversity that we have now, even knowing we still have a long way to go. Because even at this time, I wouldn't have been able to find Kat Sebastian. Well, I don't think Kat Sebastian was publishing yet. I don't think she published until I was a bookseller, so a couple of years later. But her books originally weren't even physical to my recollection. It took time for those to appear on the shelves. And so I think we take for granted a little bit the access we have now, and how that access and what we enjoy, that is what is under threat right now, and what a lot of people, through the evidence of book bans the last few years especially, are wanting to take away. So I actually think that that, oddly enough, is a very interesting segue into the start of the year. Now, I read this year, 2014, I don't know why it feels weird to say the first way. I read 259 books this year. We, do not worry, are not going to talk about all of them, and I don't remember all of them. And that's not me saying that I didn't read deeply. That's me saying that this was kind of my average for a long time, not the last couple of years. Trust me, I know. But not all of it is going to stay with you as concretely. And I think too, there's a lot of discourse about like the rating system and especially like this contentiousness about like 3 stars, whether that's a good rating or not. And for me, 3 stars means I enjoyed the book. I may have had some qualms. It depends. Like everything, my rating for myself is very subjective a lot of the time. But that on some level, I don't know if the book is going to stick with me. And not every book is going to stick with you. And I talked about this before too when I was talking about my memory, especially in relation to romances, how when I was a student in middle school, high school, my mom's best friend was an English teacher in the middle school, and she subbed a lot when I was in high school. And she like saw my reading log and was like, "You've read that many books?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course I have." And she was like, "You remember them?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course I do." And it seemed like such a silly question at the time. And now with that extra distance and age, it doesn't seem as silly a question because I don't remember those books to the same depth, obviously. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, so to speak. It does mean that some of these books from this year that I loved, I will need to revisit. And maybe that's something we could visit too. If any of these you think that I should reread and we should revisit together, let me know and we can kind of assess that. But to kind of go back to the start of the year and kind of the current moment we're in and how the two kind of converge, dovetail, however we want to think about it, supposedly, not to my recollection, but supposedly started off 2014 reading the 50 Shades of Grey series, which I think was the start of morphing and shifting the romance landscape into a lot of what we know about it today, in that it's the kind of weather vane of like the lowest common denominator of romance, but it's a little bit edgier than romance had been conceived of at the time, to the point where now I see TikToks about people going to their library and asking about things like Haunting Adeline, which I have not read and have no plans to read, but I've heard enough murmurings about that I can guess at some of the content of, and whether or not those libraries have that title, and some do. I remember 50 Shades of Grey at the time. I was working, I think I was still working at my local library over the summer because I worked for them from high school through parts of college. And remember, or keep in mind, if you have not heard this before, these were women who encouraged me as a teenager to pick up romance. They were very open and encouraging of me reading in that genre. We talked about it all the time and shared authors, and it was a very welcoming environment for me in that way. But I remember my director telling me that they weren't going to buy these books in physical print. And honestly, I do think I read these from the library, but I'm fairly certain I read them digitally. And we did, through that library, end up getting access digitally to these titles, but they weren't going to be carried in the library. And so I think if we look at just the shift that has happened in the last decade just on that front, because by today's standards, there is a lot, obviously, of critique that exists and should exist of these 3 books, especially in relation to how certain communities are portrayed in it and how much research went into that. But they almost, in some ways, probably for readers who started reading in the KU kind of realm of things, may almost feel quaint. I know for me, what no one prepared me for in these books was just how much of them were going to be emails. But I digress. Also, at this time, I did have a blog going. I don't know when I wrote the blog entry related to 50 Shades of Grey, but I do have a blog kind of analyzing these and how they are kind of quintessential fan fiction, because at this point we all know that these are fan fiction with the fan fiction part filed off, right? It feels very familiar in a lot of the tropes that honestly we see carried into books today too, but in terms of things like that wish fulfillment in the career or even outside of the relationship, the thing where after the barrier to the relationship comes down, it's about an outsider wanting in and how it kind of cycles. I don't know. I have a whole blog post about it. Sometimes it still gets hits. Okay, the next thing, again, I'm not going to go through every title, but Grounded by George Brant. This is a one-woman play that has lived many lifetimes since I first read it in 2014. I knew George in Cleveland at the time that I read this, and we did a staged reading of it at a new play festival that I was involved in. And I remember first reading this one-woman play in an Arby's. Arby's was the potbelly of Cleveland for me in terms of like the fast food place where I read a lot of things by myself if I needed to get away. But I remember thinking this came out of George's brain, and it has lived so many lifetimes since then. Anne Hathaway has been in a rendition, and most recently, this season, there is an opera at the Met for this play. It's interesting because there is apparently an ensemble. I'm very interested in that because, again, it is a one-woman show or play as it's written theatrically, but that's also a great illustration of how many lives things can lead theatrically and also how slow the theatrical process is sometimes and the development process and also how many iterations things can have. So it's just wild to look back at this list from a decade ago, see this play that was so visceral and vital to me as a reader at that time, and to see it still being visceral and vital on stages now, which is the goal of theater, right? Like that's what you hope for, but it's just wild to see in actuality. Very indicative of a particular time in terms of the pop culture, but that I'm not going to dive in too deeply on any. I also read Alice in Tumblerland, Dear Girls Above Me, if anyone remembers that era, the Rob Delaney book, and Hyperbole and a Half. So that feels like kind of a microcosm in terms of like humor books at the time. I don't know. No comment, no commentary there, just an observation that really dates this list, absolutely. Then I had Fic, Why Fanfiction is Taking Over the World by Anne Jameson. Now this is an intellectual look at fanfiction, the history of fanfiction, and the implications and kind of impact of fanfiction. Now, of course, this was written around 2014, so it's going to be dated by that. But when I was coming up, when I was younger, I read a lot of fan fiction. I don't think any of us are going to be surprised by that. At the time, it felt, even coming into this book, it felt like such an isolated thing. It wasn't a thing that was talked about as much. We were just kind of starting to talk about it more through my college years and into things like this. It's not the same landscape as it was. And at the time when I was younger, I like imagined or fantasized about being like a preeminent scholar on fan fiction when really I was just a reader of fan fiction. And this book really succeeds in that. I think I really enjoy intellectual or nonfiction looks at fandom. And I think, at least to my recollection, this book really fits well within that and succeeds at that. If I'm remembering correctly, I do think I read at least part of this at the Cleveland Public Library downtown branch, but I do not remember, but also I loved that library. In vein with this, though later in the year, to jump around just a second, but thematically it fits, I also read Fangasm, Supernatural Fangirls by Catherine Larson and Lynn S. Zubernis. Now, at the time, I was like casually watching Supernatural, but I was never like deep in, and so I was very interested in this because it was a fandom that I at least had passing familiarity of or with, but I wasn't in it in any significant way, and so I could still kind of look at things from an outside eye, and I was really excited to see a kind of almost like ethnographic study of a particular fandom. However, if Fic really succeeded, I remember this book really not working for me because the way I remember it and viewed it, at least at the time, was it seemed like it was a couple of big name fans who were using this kind of intellectual pursuit or packaging it that way in order to gain access in fandom spaces and to further cement themselves or to cement themselves as big name fans and to get access along with that. And then asking questions that were meant to kind of, in some instances, to my recollection, make the actors purposefully uncomfortable. That one just didn't work for me. And then to swing back to go a little bit more linear in terms of my reading life at the time, we had Dead Ever After and After Dead by Charlaine Harris, which many of you may remember as kind of like being the end of the Sookie Stackhouse books that the show True Blood was based on, though the books have a much different tone to them for sure. And I think, at least for me, one of the big questions, how much of a question, for me was who is Sookie going to end up with in these books? And I wrote this paragraph in a review that I wrote at the time, and I may pull from some of my reviews from the time because it's also an illustration of where my head was at the time. And also, I was clever sometimes. I don't know that I would claim to be clever now, but at least at some point, I was clever. This is not the best instance of this, but I will have one later. So I said, while these series are penned as mysteries, romance is a big part of them. So naturally, a large part of the anticipation of this book stemmed from figuring out who Sookie will end up with, if anyone at all. For many readers, I'm sure the romantic results are one of the biggest matters of contention, and that's fair. While I certainly had my preferences about who Sookie would end up with, even if I seemed to care less as the series progressed, as a sad side effect of caring less about Sookie. I was not unpleased with the final romantic wrap-up. The writing has been on the wall for a long time with this one. In fact, the romantic results may have been the only thing Harris thought about long-term, although she didn't really seem to think about how to get it there, because all of a sudden, there it was. Still, the signs have been there. And if you know who Sookie ends up with in the books, you know who Sookie ends up with in the books. From there, another notable read is The Boleyn Deceit by Laura Anderson. This is the second in a trilogy that I think started with the Boleyn King, and it is a reimagined history centered around the idea of what if Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn had had a son. And I was big into Tudor fiction at the time. I still am, but I haven't picked it up the way I did in high school through college and kind of this era. And at this time too, we were still really seeing the height of like the Philippa Gregorys of the literary world, so it makes sense that things like this were very popular. I would say if you are a fan of Six the Musical, because I've said it before in my recommendation video for books to read if you like Six the Musical, that you should check out this series for sure. Next we have Don't Even Think About It by Sarah Milanowski. Now, this book doesn't stay with me long term for anything really interesting. It was just one of the first books I read off of NetGalley as an ARC. I do remember that the point of view was a little weird because the whole point of the book is that all of these teenage girls suddenly develop essentially telepathy and that they can all kind of share a consciousness, and what secrets can come out of that or be revealed out of that. And so the point of view was attempting to live in that space, which was interesting. But the book itself was kind of like, it existed. I will say, going back to the blurb in kind of trying to refamiliarize myself with it, it might read a lot differently today than I interpreted it at the time, because these girls all got these powers through a faulty flu shot, and I don't like the idea of fear-mongering around shots, when at the time it just read as like a weird vehicle for something that was absurd. And now I worry that people wouldn't take it as absurd. This was also the year I read both The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt and The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton, which were big books of the year for multiple reasons. They were both very big books from a very practical page count standpoint, and they were also incredibly hyped, buzzy reads. And at the time, I remember enjoying them. I remember enjoying The Goldfinch at the time, but looking back, neither stayed with me in any significant way. The Luminaries was probably primed to be right up my alley more than anything, because it did kind of reflect a 19th century novel in terms of its form and its approach, and I do love a winding 19th century novel, which will come back even this year, in my reading life, this year being 2014, but at the same time, I didn't catch on to everything. I remember finishing it and then reading a review, and someone mentioned how genius it was that the chapters reduced by half as the stages of the moon went on, or like they reflected the seasons and the stages of the moon in the book. And I completely missed that, which is also on me, because to my remembrance of it, the stages of the moon were very clearly indicated in each chapter, in the visuals, but I just didn't think like that. I have never really paid attention to the moon, so maybe I missed something there. I read Days of Blood and Starlight by Lanny Taylor, and I don't remember if I read Daughter of Smoke and Bone 2014 or I must have read it 2013 because it's not on the list, but this was the time I discovered Daughter of Smoke and Bone, and I remember so distinctly 2013, 2014 feeling like a real shift in the young adult landscape for me. It was books like this, it was books like the Grishaverse. There was something happening in the young adult space at this time, and I think that it is so easy for that to feel so dated because generations move very quickly for young adult fiction. But I need to revisit Daughter of Smoke and Bone. I remember loving that series, and I love Lanny Taylor's voice. You may notice that I also need to finally read Muse of Nightmares. Fun fact, I've read Strange the Dreamer twice, and I've owned Muse of Nightmares since it came out, but Strange the Dreamer the ending of Strange the Dreamer stresses me out so much, I'm almost afraid to read it, and it has just kind of perpetually shifted to the bottom of the stack for me. Some more entries into the young adult space, because I definitely was still reading a lot of young adult at this time. We've got books like Code and Exposure by Kathy Reichs, which are connected or spun off of the Bone series, but for young adults. And it's following, I believe, Temperance's niece, and it is her werewolf series. So this was at the time that paranormal was really kind of coming off in young adult. We were kind of coming off of things like Twilight, but it was still very popular. And so this is like a sci-fi look at that through this group of teenagers that inherit these like werewolf-like abilities through science and solve mysteries, to my recollection. I remember really liking them, but that's what I've got there. We've got books like Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe, a movie I still haven't seen. I just remember that that's a movie. Books like If I Stay, which I would argue both of these are almost young adult classics, or at least they were at one point. I don't know, especially if I Stay has had the lasting power that I assumed it would. I'd be interested to know if that's still popular. We have books, young adult books like The Madman's Daughter by Megan Shepherd, which also dovetails with another book I read prior to reading The Madman's Daughter. I finally read The Island of Dr. Moreau because this is a kind of twist on it. And if you liked the book Anatomy and thought that it was revolutionary for young adult, The Madman's Daughter might be a great starting point for you, or a great read-alike for you to be able to continue to explore young adult in that kind of genre. Also, one of my favorite young adult novels at this time, Rebel Belle by Rachel Hawkins, who you probably know today best for her thrillers and her romances under the pen name Erin Sterling. But this was a kind of Buffy-esque young adult novel about a Southern belle beauty queen type who gets powers and has to save the world, essentially, and also a little bit of an enemies to lovers plotline with one of her school rivals and how he fits into the whole saving the world picture. I remember this being really quippy and fun, and Hawkins's quippiness has kind of carried over, I think, through her writing. I think it's much more evident in her romances, but it's still very clearly there in her thrillers as well. I read The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, which I need to revisit. I remember absolutely loving this book. I know that I read one of his collections, one of his posthumous collections of short stories last year, maybe, I think, that didn't sit as well with me, but I loved The Shadow of the Wind. I think I even read some of his young adult novels that you can see the kind of precursors of Shadow of the Wind through later this same year. And I have the Penguin Drop Caps edition of Shadow of the Wind up there, so I could feasibly reread it anytime I want, and I really should, because I loved the gothic atmosphere in this. I loved how it portrayed reading and readers. I should really revisit. We have The White Princess by Philippa Gregory as kind of further confirmation of this being still in the age of Philippa Gregory for me as a reader. In terms of authors that I had been a big fan of that I started to wane on a little bit in this era, you've got something like The Serpent of Venice by Christopher Moore. I read Lamb, The Gospel According to Biff, Christ's Childhood Pal, when I was in high school, and I thought it was hilarious. I thought it was so smart and funny and a little risque, and I liked the idea that with some of the books that were coming out in this era, particularly with The Serpent of Venice, we were exploring Shakespeare, and I had just graduated with a theater degree. So that felt very present and pertinent to me, but I feel like his humor started to stale for me in this era, and I do think that it's hard to kind of stay there, but that is just how I kind of felt about that. I don't know how that would hold up for me today. We've got books like I Am Malala and The Kite Runner, which I would argue are certifiably modern classics at this point. We've got Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl, which I think was coming off of the same kind of era as The Fault in Our Stars, because that came out when I was in college. And listen, I loved that book too, but this felt like in the same world as that book. It is very, very frequently on the challenge books list. So while I don't remember being blown away by it, I would absolutely defend it on that basis. Then, speaking of classics, we have George Eliot's Middlemarch. Now, this was not my first Eliot. I had read some of her shorter work, some of her earlier work, but when you think George Eliot, you're probably going to think Middlemarch, not Silas Marner, though maybe you will, because it did look like it was the second most frequently rated Eliot on Goodreads. But I remember, one, how silly I was in the reading of this. This was my first Penguin Drop Caps edition that I bought in New York City over spring break of, I guess, 2013, right before I graduated, and the Penguin Drop Caps were very new at the time. And this is a yellow Penguin Drop Caps. And I have a habit when I'm reading a book I own that has gotten better, of noticing discoloration on the pages as I'm reading. I keep and kept my hands clean, but it didn't seem at the time to really matter. So I was reading this at the time in between my Drop Caps edition and my ebook Kindle edition, because at the time all classics were free, just to try and protect my book. I remember loving Mary Garth. I remember feeling this community and these characters so vibrantly, but I don't remember a whole lot of the intricacies. I really should revisit. I do remember loving this book. I did write down in my blog some quotes I loved, and I would like to take this opportunity to force you to hear just a couple of them that really still resonate with me now. This one feels like it calls me out in particular, so you know it's a good book because it still resonates and still sees straight and cuts right to the heart of a person all of these years later. But it says, "We mortals, men and women, devour many a disappointment between breakfast and dinner time, keep back the tears and look a little pale about the lips, and in answer to inquiry say, 'Oh, nothing.' Pride helps us, and pride is not a bad thing when it only urges us to hide our own hurts, not to hurt others." I feel like that calls out all the people pleasers and the people that don't want to bother others with their feelings. Here's a good one. "Confound you, handsome young fellows. You think of having it all your own way in the world. You don't understand women. They don't admire you half so much as you admire yourselves." Moving on, we have Dune by Carrie Corp and Lori Langdon. Now, I wouldn't expect you to remember this book, but it was a YA fantasy that was a reimagining, or is a reimagining, of the Broadway musical Brigadoon. And I was so excited for this book because, one, I'm a theater person. I love musicals. I went to the Goodman production of Brigadoon that was a kind of reimagining of the book, and it was great. Not the reimagining of this book, a reimagining of the book of Brigadoon. They got the rights from the estate to kind of rewrite the book a little bit with the help of the estate. Anyway, between that and also loving Highland romances and time travel romances, I did skip over a Lynn Kurland earlier on this list because I didn't really remember anything specific about that title, but Lynn Kurland is and was one of my favorite time travel romance authors. Anyway, this book should have been right in my wheelhouse, and I remember being kind of underwhelmed by it, unfortunately. But if you too would like a fictional exploration of Brigadoon, there's your book. I have books like The Battle of the Labyrinth and The Last Olympian because I actually didn't read the Percy Jackson series until I had graduated from college. So I must have started it in 2013 and finished it in 2014 for the first time because I very distinctly remember kind of going back to that series. And it makes sense. While I would go back to Artemis Fowl kind of past my time within that real target demographic, Percy Jackson came slightly after I would have kind of aged out of that realm. However, I absolutely loved it. It took me some time, I think, to kind of get back in that headspace. The first one was kind of like just okay for me, but I think once I really settled into that world, I loved it. We've got Ruin and Rising because, again, this was part of that time where we were really seeing kind of a shift in YA, and at least in my own reading life, that really sits very firmly with Lani Taylor and Leigh Bardugo. Then we have Sinner by Maggie Stiefvater, which also feels like it kind of exists in this transition in YA. I know her Wolves and Werewolf series was incredibly popular when I want to say I was in college. It felt like it was impossible to escape them, and as much as I love the Raven Boys, I don't know that those books, the werewolf books, are as nostalgic for me. I liked what they were doing, and they were so clearly in a transition moment in the market with ebooks coming onto the scene and them making the choice to make the books in color. Like the font itself was printed in color, which worked really well for the first book, which was blue, and it works less well for me and my eyes for a book that was written in red ink, though they did make it darker to try and help with that. And Sinner was the fourth in that original kind of trilogy as a follow-up. In that same kind of vein of the paranormal, and bridging between young adult and adult, we have some Sherilyn Kenyon. I read a number of the Dark Hunter romance books, which were paranormal romance. I need to finish that series. And I also started and need to finish the young adult spin-off of that, The Chronicles of Nick, which is like a paranormal YA series. It does, to my recollection, skew, he starts out younger, so that may be of interest, and it does have a male protagonist, but I remember needing to finish the original Dark Hunter books because at the time the Acheron, Acheron, I don't know how it's pronounced, book hadn't happened yet, and that was what it felt like everything was kind of building up to in between the Dark Hunters and the Nick books. So if you've read that series in totality, report back. I'm seeing American Rose, which is the nonfiction account of the life of Gypsy Rose Lee, who the musical Gypsy is based on, which reminds me that further down, additionally, I did read Devil in the White City this year, 2014. And I really should revisit that because I have been living in Chicago a lot longer now. At the time, I'd only had one summer in Chicago as a kind of frame of reference. I remember really being more intrigued by the H.H. Holmes parts of that book, which probably isn't in my favor, but nonetheless. And in 2014, this had already been a well-established, well-received book, which brings me to a young adult series that I finally got around to reading this year that was well-established. And I fully admit that I had not read prior to 2014 because the cover of the first book, The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner, in our local library was the old 90s cover, and I just didn't pick it up. But I loved this series. I've actually been thinking about for years needing to go back and reread it, especially because there were like sequels that were put out and there were new covers. It was repackaged. It's a great series. It has lasted this long for a reason. And I remember the twist of the first book being really fun. So yeah, definitely a young adult fantasy series that I would recommend to this day. We have Brave New World because I was trying to circle back and touch a lot of classics I hadn't yet touched. I don't remember being blown away by it, but I do acknowledge that dystopias, especially now, it's good to have that familiarity with in order to be able to kind of critique our current moment against these imagined moments and how those imagined moments grew out of the current moment. In addition, though, then to literature or classics I was going back to touch, I got The Three Musketeers. I finally read The Three Musketeers. Now, I will say I still truly believe that classics in translation, like The Three Musketeers, like Anna Karenina, heck, like War and Peace, though it is very, very long. It took me an entire winter break to read in college. But I think that those classics in translation are almost more accessible sometimes than classics in English, simply because in the act of translating, the syntax is often kind of massaged a little bit to sound more natural to a modern ear, and it's a little bit smoother, where the English classics, which I still love, we read Middlemarch earlier this year, right? I mean, not, you know what I mean. You have to kind of get used to it a little bit more. So if classics feel intimidating to you, maybe don't start out with War and Peace, but I would suggest potentially picking up something in translation because it may be a little more accessible. Now, I am going to read a paragraph I wrote in my review of The Three Musketeers because I've seen iterations of The Three Musketeers on film and iterations of the kind of story and tropes of The Three Musketeers, and yet I still don't think I knew how rompy the book itself was going to be. So here's what I wrote. I said, you know that scene in action movies where people walk away from an explosion in slow-mo? That's kind of what I picture with this book, except our heroes probably set the fire. Maybe by accident, but they wouldn't claim it wasn't. The motto of the Musketeers may be one for all and all for one, but it might as well be I racked up a large body count over a small perceived slight, or because I was bored. You know what? YOLO. D'Artagnan spends most of the novel notably not working on his anger management issues and working to officially become a musketeer. Naturally, he makes all his best friends by way of sword fight. And you know what? Sure, that's the Three Musketeers. Moving along, I read Goddess of Yesterday by Carolyn B. Cooney, most notably probably known for books like The Face on the Milk Carton, but for me personally, most known for the time travel romances Both Sides of Time. And this is a reimagining of the Trojan War, and I liked it quite a lot. I never actually got through The Face on the Milk Carton, but anything that kind of touches against history within Carolyn B. Cooney's wheelhouse, I have enjoyed. Oh, speaking of a place and time, I have both Thrive by Ariana Huffington and Girl Boss that I read in 2014, and what a picture of a moment. And now moving into a potentially controversial opinion, so brace yourselves. I'll brace myself. I know Red Rising has had a kind of renaissance on the book internet, especially since TikTok, and I have friends who have loved this series. I didn't dislike the first book, but I remember being kind of meh on it, and I remember thinking it wasn't as revolutionary as it thinks it is, because it does feel like it is pulling on a lot of familiar tropes, which I don't mind. What I had trouble with was the killing of the wife at the beginning of the book, who was a very flat character, in order to forward our hero's entire journey, and that relationship and that motivation ringing very hollow to me personally. I don't know. From there, I read The Divine Comedy, which honestly probably is in line much more than it would appear. They weren't back-to-back reads, but I remember going to Barnes & Noble and asking for like the best translation of this. I guess I got the newest translation. I don't really have thoughts on it. I read The Divine Comedy. I also read The Queen of the Tierling, which is very much a fantasy of this era. The first book is so good. The second book has a lot of flashbacks. The third book exists. But the first book, in 2014, we were riding high on The Queen of the Tierling, and I kind of wish I could recapture that moment sometimes. This was also the year I read Bad Feminist, which is how I know I am moving in to the part of the year where I was a substitute teacher, because I so clearly remember reading this on prep periods. I love Roxane Gay, and I have not read her newest book, which I bought on Indie Bookstore Day, but Bad Feminist, while it probably feels like a product of its time now, and everything is a product of its time in some way, I remember it feeling so revolutionary to me, and I loved the cultural critique in the essays. I love essays that have like a cultural critique and kind of engages with pop culture especially. And so these were just exactly what I was looking for, and I was so new to essays at the time too, that it was just such a wide world that it was opening for me. And yeah, along with that, another book that has stuck with me through and remains current for me in my reading life this year, The Book of Unknown Americans by Christina Enriquez. You may remember I just bought her historical fiction that came out this year at Printers Row Lit Fest. I still need to read it, but this book is a really insightful, heartbreaking look at immigration in America and at family and at young people's lives. And I remember this just really, really moving something in me. And yeah, I really, really enjoyed this book. But I also caution you, it is not a light book in terms of its emotions. So I encourage you to read it, but definitely keep that in mind, in a kind of whiplash of tone, which is probably incredibly purposeful because I needed a palate cleanser after that. I read The Mark of the Midnight Manzanilla by Lauren Willig, which is part of her Secret Histories of the Pink Carnation series, the first of which I reread last year in a vlog, and it's part romance, part historical spy romp a la The Scarlet Pimpernel, and it also has an overarching modern romance that is tying everything together as each book focuses on different historical couples and historical spies, and I loved this series. It started when I was in high school, and it didn't end until, I want to say, my first year in Chicago. So I want to say like 2015. So this was toward the end of that series, but it's interesting, like the series that span significant portions or parts of your life, and I definitely adored this series. I read My Life in Middlemarch by Rebecca Mead. I don't remember much about the book, but I definitely read it kind of in conversation, having read Middlemarch earlier in the year, and honestly, I may have known that was coming out and expedited my read of Middlemarch to align with getting to read that book, if I know myself at all. but I really can't remember. I read Dorothy Must Die by Danielle Page, which may be something you want to pick up in light of Wicked coming out later this month, because it is a reimagining of The Wizard of Oz through a new lens, and it was a contemporary fantasy that updated that story for modern young adult readers. It wasn't my personal favorite, but I loved the ideas behind it, and I loved how campy Dorothy was as a villain, and also portraying Dorothy as a villain. So I do think it's a lot of fun. I read The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton, which wasn't my first Edith Wharton. It did spark this kind of brainchild that I've had for years and never really fully dove into or researched. I have this theory that Gossip Girl is based on or kind of spun off of Edith Wharton, or like all of the ties and connections you can see between Gossip Girl and Edith Wharton, but I've never really played fully with that idea. But a lot of it comes from House of Mirth, particularly Lily Bart coming back into the city and how that reflects and parallels Serena coming back into the city in both the book and the show. I don't know. I really should kind of investigate that further one day, but I've talked about it enough that someone probably has already done it themselves, because I by no means think that that is a singular observation. From there, I mean, I'm skipping over and just kind of brushing against books. I read The Borrower by Rebecca Makkai, which was my first Makkai. It's not my favorite of hers, but it was my first. I also then read, very close together, Station 11 and The Bone Clocks at the same time. And honestly, these two titles and this particular moment of this year really kind of represent my 2014 reading life to me personally. Like, if I think about it as a reflection and emotionally, these are the two books that I think of. I remember reading both of these on prep periods. I was probably reading both of these digitally on an iPad from a library loan, which is mind-boggling to me now. Like, at the time, I loved nothing more than having a book with me everywhere, which I still do, but that would mean on my phone, on an iPad, and I still had my original Kindle as well. But now I have to have e-ink or paper. I can't do long-term reading on a screen like that anymore, unfortunately, but I used to read a lot of books on my prep periods and lunches as a substitute on my iPad. As for the titles themselves, Station 11 and The Bone Clocks, I don't really know exactly what to say about them, but I think that they opened up a new world of literature for me. Both of them deal with these big overarching themes, but they have these elements of the odd, even if it's not front and center. I like to say about The Bone Clocks that all of the odd is kind of happening in the periphery, and we see that kind of come into focus a little bit more in Slade House, but I remember just being kind of in awe of that and the tone it set, and feeling like there was this kind of fantastical in play without it really being a fantasy. And I know there are sci-fi elements to both of them, absolutely, but I think it is genre bending in a way that I just hadn't really encountered before. And maybe had encountered before, but the voice was just so good. I don't know, but I really hold a lot of love for that time in my reading life. All of the movement between these books feels very abrupt and shifty, but we're just kind of casually talking about these. So I also read Sin in the Second City by Karen Abbott. I think, yeah, she wrote the Gypsy Rose Lee book as well, but this is about the kind of vice history of Chicago. I sold a lot of this book as a hand sell when I was a bookseller because it was local history, it was interesting to people who were tourists, but it was also like just scandalous enough that it was of interest. So if you have not read this one, definitely one to check out. I mentioned this one in my Uglies video, but Afterworlds by Scott Westerfeld, which came out, and I remember being really excited about because I loved Scott Westerfeld. And I posted something about like waiting to get it, and my high school friend Sean messaged me and he's like, "What's your email?" And I gave it to him because I had no context of like where the question was coming from. What he emailed me was a gifted copy of Afterworlds. And at the time, being gifted a Kindle copy of a book was still really novel. Honestly, that may be the only time I've been gifted a specific title, so it may still be very novel to be gifted a specific ebook. But I remember just being so happy and grateful and seen by that gift from a good friend, and it meant a lot. If we're going to talk about the young adult landscape at this time, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, especially since I read Anna and the French Kiss, which I had a middle schooler at the time who was just obsessed with this series. This was like all she was interested in reading. I wonder if she ever read To All the Boys I Loved Before. I think she would have loved those books. Anyway, I remember I did have trouble with this one at the start because this one did have a little bit of infidelity to my reading experience. And it's hard because they're teenagers, they're navigating this and what it means to like have attractions and all of this. I thought it was really sweet ultimately, but I would never claim it as my favorite in the series based on that alone. However, I don't remember if it's this one or one later in the series, but I do remember that there is a father figure in one of the books that is basically crafted to be kind of like a Nicholas Sparks and contending with the reality of Nicholas Sparks, and I did enjoy that quite a lot. I talk a lot on this channel about not being inherently drawn to intergenerational kind of stories. However, The Strange and Beautiful Sorrows of Ava Lavender by Leslie Walton, while a deep and sad book to my recollection, I remember loving this so much. It's so lyrical. I think if you like Anna Marie McLemore, particularly When the Moon Was Ours, and that kind of lyricism in the prose, the way that sorrow manifests into physicality. I hesitate to call Ava Lavender magical realism, but it is within the same vein, absolutely. And then we have the renaissance of my historical romance reading life. I was still a historical romance reader through this period, clearly, but this next title for me in my reading life really marks a shift, and it revitalized my interest in the genre that has always been my go-to within romance and where I started as a romance reader, and that is, to no surprise probably of anyone who has been here for a second, A Rogue by Any Other Name by Sarah MacLean. So her Rules for Scoundrels series that takes place in a gaming hell. I love this series. I reread it. I also read this same year One Good Earl Deserves a Lover and No Good Duke Goes Unpunished. I do not remember if the last one, I don't think the last one was out yet, but I loved these books. I continue to love these books. I don't know where they stand within the Sarah MacLean lexicon in terms of favorites, but they hold a very special place in my heart, and I love the setting so much. Now, the hero in A Rogue by Any Other Name, you might want to punch every once in a while, and I talked about that when I reread it in a wrap-up, but I think that there's just something special about the tone of these books to me, and I know that at the time they were kind of controversial in the sense that some readers felt MacLean felt too modern, but we know that historical romance is always speaking to the time it's written for and not the time it's written about. And it still grapples with the history in a really active way while presenting these strong women at the center of these stories and at the center of their destinies. And it's fun, it's quippy. I love her titles, especially in this era and this series. And yeah, I just really hold a special place for this too. And this is part of why 2014 looms so large for me, because I have this mix of like the before and also these new things I'm discovering, and the world of reading was opening up, the world of discovery was opening up, and I just had more access and time to discover these books. So let's do some speed rounds through some of these others. Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. Never enough good things to say about that. That was like a classic the minute it became a book. I loved that book so much. I do need to revisit that one. Grave Mercy by Robin Lefevers. I need to revisit this series because there's a follow-up series that I tried to start reading. I own the first book and I got a little lost in it because I need to revisit. I don't think you would have trouble if you hadn't read the original trilogy, but because I had and I knew that there were things I was forgetting that were connections, it was bothering me. Fallen by Lauren Kate. I read off of hype and I did not like. The Girl with All the Gifts felt like it was everywhere this year. Like the way that this book was talked about and like the surprise of this book may not be so surprising today, but I remember really, really enjoying this, and it's kind of like blend of sci-fi and horror, and I don't know, I don't feel like this book has lasted, and I don't see it talked about in the same way that I expected. Like, we still see people talking about Red Rising, but I don't see people talking as actively about The Girl with All the Gifts, which may just be me, or it may be that the surprise of it has already kind of been spoiled for too many readers. I don't know, but I really did enjoy the book at the time it came out. Unmade by Sarah Rees Brennan, which is the third in the Lyburn Legacy trilogy, young adult trilogy. If you are reading Long Live Evil right now, or have that on your radar, I loved this young adult series when it came out. The Supernatural Enhancements by Edgar Quintero is a kind of like haunted house spin on a haunted house book. Some of the formatting seems reminiscent, or like it is spinning off of something like House of Leaves. though I do admit I have not read House of Leaves. At the time, before The Ghost Bride, it was my favorite Barnes & Noble Discovery Bay pick, and I definitely bought it with a coupon. Belzar by Meg Wolitzer was supposed to be a kind of young adult reckoning or reimagining or in conversation with the bell jar, and I did not like it. I thought it was a huge disappointment. And then I went on years later to also be hugely disappointed by The Interestings, which I thought was just like second wave feminist thought with no interrogation of intersectionality. So I don't know that I actually like Meg Wolitzer books. Talon by Julie Kagawa, I remember nothing about except that there was a dragon involved. So if you are in search of dragon books, maybe that would be up your alley, but it doesn't stick with me in any memorable kind of way, which is not a great sign. Oh, I gave it 2 stars. So St. Lucy's Home for Girls Raised by Wolves by Karen Russell was one of the first odd short story collections I read, and I love quite a lot. Because of that, I would have to go back and revisit. I don't know. I think this was the collection that had the short story that Swamplandia came out of. I've never read Swamplandia. I have read some critiques of Swamplandia. But what I do know is I was reading this on an iPad in the office of an elementary school gymnasium as I was subbing for PE and potentially writing a note about how the 4th graders needed to be nicer to one another, while also reading an article about the upcoming Taylor Swift album, 1989. We've got The Sum of All Kisses by Julia Quinn when we were actively getting new Julia Quinn books. What a time, right? And this is the 3rd in the infamous Smythe Smith Quartet. Jacoby by William Ritter, which was a kind of combination of Sherlock and Doctor Who and like dark, gritty Victorian paranormal mystery at the height of the Super Hulock era, which I do not wish to invoke in any way and know nothing of other than all of the memes I was forced to consume. And Mercy by Toni Morrison is here, which is baffling to me because I did not think it had been a decade since I had read that book. And yet here it sits. And I know that I was keeping dates correct at this time, so it's been a decade since I've read A Mercy by Toni Morrison, so there's that. Oh, it looks like I did read Never Judge a Lady by Her Cover by Sarah MacLean as well this year. The Mime Order by Samantha Shannon. Now, I remember I read The Bone Season in 2013, but the end of it, I want to say it was over Thanksgiving break because I was home alone in an apprentice house making Chex Mix and reading The Bone Season, which is exactly what I wanted to be doing. But both The Bone Season and The Mime Order, as hyped as they were kind of disappointing reads for me. They did that thing that I talk about where they made me feel kind of fuzzy in the brain. I felt very distanced from the narrative. I went back to The Mime Order thinking that it would get better, really wanting to be engaged with the story because it seemed right up my alley, and it just couldn't hook me. And because of that, I just really haven't revisited Samantha Shannon in the way that I probably should, and I know she's had incredibly popular books since this. I don't know, let me know if you think I should circle back to Samantha Shannon. All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr, which really dominated this era. It recently became a movie I have not watched. I remember loving the book. When I was a bookseller, everyone was coming in for read-alikes for either All the Light We Cannot See and The Nightingale, or The Girl on the Train. That's, well, I guess Gone Girl also fit in that, but Gone Girl was older than The Girl on the Train, so they were frequently asking for something after The Girl on the Train. And that is a very succinct summarization of the era in which I was a bookseller. To kind of wrap up books that are catching my eye, because again, I don't want to keep us here forever, and feel free to sound off on any I may not have touched on below. I may or may not have thoughts still about them, but this definitely is a kind of snapshot, like I said, of my reading life. I mean, it's very clearly a snapshot of my reading life. I will say it's clearly not diverse enough, right? And so that is something I've worked very hard on over the years. I can't say I always succeed, but I definitely, looking back, I remember thinking that I was reading more diversely here than I actually was. And that's just something we continue to contend with and gain more access to. And that's part of why it is so important that we continue to have access to these stories and to these books, and the way that bookish spaces online help us open up that world and discover new titles as well. But to kind of wrap it up here, I see The Shining Girls by Lauren Bukes, which when I was a bookseller, we would have very heated debates about whether Broken Monsters or The Shining Girls was the superior Lauren Bukes. I was firmly team Shining Girls, which is about a time-traveling serial killer in Chicago. And I think it's pretty obvious that with the time travel element, that's going to gain an edge for me. Both of these books are dark, oddly Midwestern considering she was not raised in the Midwest, and a weird kind of supernatural with a horror bend in the real modern setting, and almost like crime narratives as well. So I very much loved them. I had a preference for the Shining Girls. I did reread it on audio maybe 2019, and I don't know if I loved it as much as I remember loving it, but I did. And then we have 100 Essays I Don't Have Time to Write by Sarah Ruhl, which are just like short little thoughts, particularly on the theater, but also just on creation and art and building something. And I love these essays because they are incredibly digestible. They're very compassionate. She has a love letter to dramaturgs, so I accept the pandering a little bit. And honestly, that essay meant a lot to me when it came out, when I was still actively pursuing dramaturgy as a full-time career path and feeling very adrift. It made my work feel seen, and it made me feel like I was important to the process. And yeah, but okay, that's kind of a snapshot of my reading life in 2014. I would be interested to hear how it compares to yours in the sense of what you feel the kind of zeitgeist or spirit of your reading in 2014 was, where you felt the shifts happening in your reading life, things like that. And if you're still here, thank you for being interested enough in what I was up to in 2014 to still be here. I know we kind of glossed over a lot of titles, but there's no way we could have talked about approximately 260 titles in depth. That's just not feasible. So we did kind of the broad strokes, but if this is a thought experiment you would like to investigate further, let me know. Thanks for hanging out. As always, like and subscribe if you feel like it, read something good, and yeah, bye.